Hi, my name is Thane Rosenbaum. I am the creative director of Folks, the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. And tonight, in connection and in association with the 92nd Street Y, welcome to my bedroom. Now, let me tell you something about my bedroom. Nothing interesting ever actually happens here, except for tonight. Because tonight we're going to hear a very provocative conversation about hate speech and its relationship to free speech. And we'll be having it with three icons, frankly, of the First Amendment and free speech, who also happen to be my personal friends. Now, the occasion for tonight's discussion, which was set up many, many months ago, is the publication of my new book, a provocative book with the title Saving Free Speech from Itself. And I should tell you that this book, Saving Free Speech from Itself, was published on March 14th. And I know what you're thinking, great timing for a publication thing. Yes, it was not the best timing because the world really wasn't so much interested on March 14th, given the fact that there was a global pandemic. But tonight, at least, in connection with the ongoing series that we have here, Folks Conversation Series, and at the 92nd Street Y, this is the topic of tonight's conversation. And I'll introduce you to our guests soon, but let me just state the obvious. Yes, we're coming from my bedroom. Nadine Strossen will be joining us, along with Floyd Abrams and Bret Stephens. They, I think, are coming from offices in their homes. We are coming to you all from separate locations because we are practicing social distancing, even when it comes to the life of the mind. But we are still engaging the life of the mind. We are still providing a public service, both Folks and the 92nd Street Y, to engage your intellectual and entertainment needs. We haven't gone away. But it is something that I should point out, which is we are both nonprofits. And this is a challenging time for nonprofits. The 92nd Street Y in particular, as you know, it's a jewel of New York City. I myself have been hosting events there for well over 20 years. I consider it a second home. It's a big building. It's got a lot of mouths to feed. And donating now to the 92nd Street Y would be really wonderful. By the way, while you're there, donating also to Folks at folks.org would also be helpful. We are also a nonprofit. I started it 15 years ago. So if you're in a generous mood tonight, you know, it was a very reasonable ticket. So hopefully you'll be so engaged that at some point you'll donate. One more house cleaning event mentioning. If you're receiving CLE credit tonight, you need to sign in and sign out. The way to do that is on the web page for Zoom or everyone now. You should go to the bottom of your page, click on the talk bubble, and that's the chat section. And the chat section will provide information at the beginning and at the end. First of all, it'll give you the links to my book and also the books that Floyd, Bret, and Nadine have written. So you'll be able to click and support those books as well. You'll also be able to sign in and sign out for CLE. You'll also be able to provide your comments throughout the evening. And if you have a question for us, you can leave it there and hopefully we'll get to it. So let me introduce my friends and guests. First, the person I like to think of as the First Lady of the First Amendment, my dear friend, Nadine Strossen, who is a constitutional law professor at New York Law School and is a former executive director of the President of the American Civil Liberties Union and was surely the very first president of the ACLU, Nadine Strossen. We also have Floyd Abrams, although I think we've lost him for a moment. Hopefully he'll return. Floyd is America's leading First Amendment lawyer. He is an icon in many ways. He, for a number of decades, represented the New York Times, and actually during all of those years, the New York Times had never once lost a libel suit. Hey, speaking of the New York Times, another friend of mine, again, all three of these people are not only my friends, they've also been guests at Folks for a number of years. I'm introducing to you Bret Stephens, who is the Pulitzer Prize winning columnist for the New York Times. He's also an analyst in MSNBC. So let me thank Nadine and thank Bret and Floyd. I hope you come back and join us at some point. I have a little wind up here, so this wind up hopefully will get Floyd back in the game. I think it's fair to say to the audience, they should know, we are friends, but my friends don't agree with almost anything in this book. Bret actually wrote the foreword graciously for this book. But again, he says in the book, he says in the foreword, I don't really agree with this. This is a provocative book from an American's perspective about the meaning of free speech. And we'll talk about what makes it so provocative. The fact that they disagree is not a problem, not because we're friends, it's because isn't that really the purpose of the free speech clause of the First Amendment? It's to be able to debate ideas. Now let me give you that, let me repeat that again, to debate ideas. That's what the founding fathers, our founding fathers, were thinking of. Encourage the new citizens to come to the public square, engage in representative democracy, become better informed, be able to become better decision makers, be given an opportunity to criticize the government if you wish to, hope for human enrichment, human betterment, advance the causes of science, culture, good government, ideas that have redeeming social value. Now that I've said that, you're seeing already Nadine shaking her head no. I want to know, where's the redeeming social value in marching Nazis on communities of Holocaust survivors, cross burners on the lawns of African Americans, people wearing t-shirts saying Muslims go home, Muslims are responsible for 9/11. In what are the ideas there? That we should gas Jews, that we should hang African Americans, that we should beat up Muslims. Help me through this. What are the big ideas there? And one last comment, and then I'll let Nadine start because she is completely ready to go here. I think it's important to remember that we permit and tolerate an enormous amount of emotional and physical harm in the name of free speech that is frankly nothing more than hate speech and really doesn't have redeeming social value. And lastly, we are not the only liberal democracy in the world, but we are an outlier when it comes to free speech. Let me repeat this. The Europeans are laughing at us. Okay, they also understand the enlightened philosophers. They're also born out of the cradle of the Enlightenment. They read the same books. They have constitutions. They read Locke and Rousseau and Jefferson and Kant. And at the same time, they honor free speech, but they also honor human dignity. And they do not allow others to trample on the sensitivities and the citizenship rights of equality and equal protection and social status that should be guaranteed to all citizens. We don't do that. Free speech always supersedes other liberties. And by the way, dignity doesn't even appear in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence. And with that provocative opening, Nadine, tear it apart.
Oh, wow. It's hard to know where to start, but let's start with the first point that you made, Thane, which is that free speech should only be protected not only if it conveys an idea, but it has to be an idea with, quote, redeeming social value, close quote. Can you imagine what would happen to this democracy if a prerequisite for our free speech was that a government official, maybe a judge, maybe another government official, had to decide whether what we said had redeeming social value? I suspect that a lot of what is in the New York Times, for example, in the Trump administration, would be deemed to not have redeeming social value. Moreover,
but also not cause harm. It's not just social value. Speech that actually causes harm.
Well, look, there is certain speech when it is tightly and directly linked to harm can and should be punished consistent with the First Amendment. So many critics, including you, Thane, over-exaggerate the extent to which the First Amendment is absolute. It is not, but it just insists that before speech can be punished, it must directly cause certain specific serious, imminent harm. And harm to somebody's sense of dignity or offending somebody's feelings, that is a significant harm. I'm not going to deny it. But the philosophy of the First Amendment is that more harm is caused by empowering government to suppress speech on that rationale. On that rationale, that is exactly why dissidents and protesters and social justice crusaders for equality and dignity throughout US history have been attacked and had their speech suppressed. Why did Martin Luther King write his historic letter from a Birmingham jail? He was assaulting the dignity of people who wanted to preserve segregation. And
No, he wasn't.
Self-centered.
No, he wasn't. No jury would believe that. It's too crazy.
I'm afraid that judges and juries did subscribe to those messages, Thane, and the same has been true for anti-war protesters throughout history, advocates for abolition, for women's suffrage, reproductive freedom, you name it. Whatever is not, if the government has power to suppress on such a vague, overbroad, quote, standard as offending dignity, then we can predict that those who lack political and cultural power, those who are advocating reform, are going to be the ones who are disproportionately silenced. And that's what happens under so-called hate speech laws in Europe and other countries that have those laws. And now I will self-censor because I know my other co-panelists have.
Bret, Floyd, want to jump in?
Well, Thane, I have to acknowledge that about 12 years ago, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited the campus of Columbia University.
And he was, at the time, the president of Iran.
The president of Iran, who had openly called for wiping Israel off the map and had said all kinds of things. I was more sympathetic to your point of view. And in fact, wrote a column denouncing Columbia's decision to invite him.
No, but is it because you thought that wiping Israel off the map is not an idea in itself that's deserving protection within the marketplace of ideas? Or was there some other reason that you felt that he should not be granted the esteemed pulpit of an Ivy League university?
Well, my view is that, in fact, it's a very powerful idea, obviously a very hateful idea, and that ideas have consequences, ideas have power, and that they could have, even as detestable as Ahmadinejad may have seemed to a majority of the audience, it could have had a persuasive effect on some significant minority, and that didn't belong, that wasn't the sort of speech that at least a university like Columbia should honor. Now, obviously, in the narrow sense, I was right in that Columbia is a private institution, and the First Amendment doesn't apply to it as it might to a public university or some other public place. But I've since grown much closer to Nadine's position. I think that the idea that you can empower some government official, whether it's a judge, a president, to determine what sorts of ideas should be deemed hateful, what sorts of ideas have redeeming social value, I think is inherently dangerous. And I think, in fact, quite foolish. And I've also changed my mind because I think that the threat to free speech and the threat to the First Amendment today in 2020 is much greater than I ever imagined it would be back in 2006. That's to say, in 2006, I thought that most of us reasonable people could draw a very broad circle for what could be considered acceptable free speech, while excluding the more hateful voices like Ahmadinejad's or someone else's. Today, we're living in a world in which I think it's becoming more and more difficult to speak freely. And people who are espousing ideas that are not so hateful, not so radical, not so unusual, or wouldn't have been considered hateful or radical just a few years ago, are now being treated as pariahs in the marketplace of ideas. And so therefore the importance of kind of I don't want to say First Amendment absolutism, but the importance of speaking up for the principle of free speech, not only as a legal concept, but as an essential concept in the way in which we conduct our lives publicly has become more important to me. You know, I was taken to task about this very thing a couple of years ago, and Isaac Chotiner, who specializes in these gotcha interviews for the New Yorker, interviewed me on this very theme. And I think he was somewhat taken aback when he asked me about my previous views with respect to Ahmadinejad. And I said, Isaac, you know, I've changed my mind. And I'm glad I've changed my mind, because I think the position that people like Nadine and Floyd have held consistently for many years is in fact the wise and mature position, even if it means that we are going to have to accept types of speech that I think any civilized person would consider hateful and detestable and so on, because the risk of an encroachment into what is acceptable speech is so grave to our liberties that we're going to accept a great deal that we dislike for the sake of making sure that the social reformer, the activist, the gadfly, the nuisance also has his or her right to speak freely.
Lloyd, I have many responses to what we've just heard, but please join in first.
Yeah. I'd just like to add a related thought to really supporting what Bret has said about how things have changed. What I have to say is not political, but it cannot ignore who's in the White House. I mean, we have a situation now in which truthful reporting is denounced as fake news, and honorable reporters denounced as enemies of the people. And so it is not unfair to ask, suppose the First Amendment were not as strong as it is. So suppose it were not as powerful, as all-encompassing, with exceptions, but nonetheless, as strong as it is. And this president asked this attorney general to do something or tell him what he could do. If we didn't have a really strong First Amendment, indeed a First Amendment which goes beyond that in any other country in the world, we could be at much greater peril than we might have imagined just a few years ago. And a second point, which I'll be briefer on, but involving the president on the other side. We have a situation where once we start to say that this sort of speech can be made illegal or that, where the speech, does not do national security harm of enormous interest or libel people in a fashion that our libel law does provide a remedy for. I mean, think back to the last political campaign in which then candidate Trump was saying of Mexicans, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. There are countries in the world in which that would be a crime for him to have said. Indeed, that is the case in most of democratic Western Europe. Now, we've chosen to go on a different path. And I think we've chosen the right path.
Right, well, that was.
I'm sorry.
If I could add to Floyd's.
Well, that was the original question. Why are we the outlier? Why is it that these other Western democracies would not tolerate this level of permissiveness of speech that could cause harm? Why is it that they look upon us as an outlier and wonder why neo-Nazis aren't marched straight to jail? Or Klansmen.
Yeah, because they are in Germany, by the way. Just very recently, an 89-year-old Holocaust denier, they call her the grandma, I think she's probably more like a great-grandma, was actually put in prison in Germany for several years for denying the Holocaust. Now, with the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the modern world, has Germany combated anti-Semitism any more effectively than the United States has?
But that's not the point.
Of violence against Jews, as well as violence against Roma, against refugees, against immigrants in Germany, are so severe that last year, Angela Merkel, for the first time in German history, appointed a cabinet-level commissioner for anti-Semitism. And that person, as well as the leader, the Jewish leader of the umbrella coalition of Jewish organizations in Germany, warned Jews that it is not safe to wear the yarmulke in public everywhere in Germany. So these anti-hate speech laws certainly
Can I add
The
to
principle, but Nadine, it shouldn't matter. Yes, it would be better that the laws ultimately resulted in the end of anti-Semitism, but nobody would believe that that could possibly happen. That doesn't change, it doesn't change the principle that, you know what, an 89-year-old Holocaust denier should be in jail.
Why?
What principle is that?
Change your mind? Is that going to protect Jews from?
It's not about protecting the point. It's both a legal and a moral imperative. To deny a historical atrocity is a crime. To devalue a genocide is a crime, whether you're 89
so Thane, can I
or
ask
whether
you
you're
something?
29.
But Thane, let me ask you something. In my view, I think marriage equality is a great victory for human rights. And I think the way in which gay Americans were treated for generations was a horror. That being said, a great many people in America, for one reason or another, oppose marriage equality, some on bigoted grounds, some on somewhat less bigoted grounds, and so on. They are, you might say, denying the dignity and the humanity of many of their brothers and sisters. But let's imagine, I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine that if speech rights were more attenuated in the United States, if they were on a more European basis, if you will, we could have scenarios in which Americans, for whatever reason, who express disapproval of gay marriage, a view I'm not at all in sympathy with, but who express disapproval, could also face legal or criminal sanctions because someone makes the perfectly commonsensical point that to deny marriage equality is, if not exactly Holocaust denial, is denying the basic human dignity of gay men and women.
But that's different that's a different dignification problem. That is not the harm is, as I started off, I said, ideas are always up for grabs under the First Amendment. If a neo-Nazi wants to publish an op-ed about Jews, not about gassing Jews, but about, say, Jewish control of the media, which is just anti-Semitic, but is very different from marching on a community of Holocaust survivors, that's an idea. I'm welcoming the Klan to write their op-eds or to write, what I don't want to see is Charlottesville, where all marchers.
They are ideas that we strongly reject, but they are ideas. And when powerful people and powerful groups have those ideas, it behooves those of us who are frightened by those ideas and want to expose them and want to debate them and want to counter them with measures against discrimination and against violence, then we need to hear those ideas. It was horrifying to me as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I know you're also the child of a Holocaust survivor's thing, to hear those white supremacists in Charlottesville chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." That is a very important idea for us to understand the basis of their anti-Semitism. In order to be able to expose it, to challenge it, to track them, law enforcement and counterterrorism officials say that they oppose censorship because they want to be able to track these people and make sure that they don't engage in actual violence. And some of them, a surprising number of them, are actually susceptible to being recruited away from those hateful ideas, even former leaders of hate organizations, including Megan Phelps Roper of the Westboro Baptist Church, and Derek Black, the Stormfront, have been recruited away and are dedicating their lives to preventing other people or recruiting other people away from those organizations.
Yeah, but Nadine,
That's not going to be an option.
Nadine, isn't it true that, or don't you agree that even if that were not the case,
Yes.
even if these people were locked in and we knew perfectly well that they weren't going to change their mind, that we think that the First Amendment serves us well by protecting all speakers when they voice ideas.
Stop saying
So
ideas.
let me give you an example. I mean, in
They're not ideas, Floyd. They're just not. We're granting them a
why are they
status
not
that
ideas?
they simply don't deserve. There is
Why?
no idea. Jews will not replace us is not an idea.
It is an idea.
It is a slogan which comes from an idea. Of course it is. Here's another one. In Belgium, not so long ago, somebody was convicted of a crime for having signs saying Belgium and European first. Stop the sham immigration policy. Stand up against Islamism of Belgium. That is an idea. It is an idea that Belgian courts held could not be expressed, that the European Court on Human Rights affirmed the Belgian court in saying could be made criminal in the otherwise quite free country of Belgium. And, my view is that they're wrong. So in answer to your first question, why are we so different? I think we're viewing the matter in a manner which is more likely to serve the broad public interest of living in a free democratic society than would otherwise have been possible.
All right, let me.
Can I add to what
Yeah,
Floyd
go on.
said, because I think he's saying something very important. First of all, I think we're different because we're better, if I may say so, here in the United States. I think we have a more enlightened view of speech than our friends in Germany or France. And speaking of Germany and France, in France, the second biggest vote getter in the last presidential election was the neo-fascist Marine Le Pen and the National Front. In Germany, the third largest political party is the Alternative for Germany, which is shot through with fascistic impulses. So how is it that in two countries that go out of their way to criminalize hate speech, do you have two political parties that have achieved so much power despite sort of being at the quasi-criminal fringe? I would argue that when you try to suppress their views through force of law, you give them a kind of political currency as a sort of act of brave subversion, which they wouldn't garner and certainly don't deserve if they were competing in a more open marketplace of ideas where they weren't being suppressed.
This happened during the Weimar Republic as well, when Germany already had extremely strong anti-hate speech laws that were strictly enforced, including against Julius Streicher and many Nazis. And they welcomed the prosecutions as a propaganda platform that gained them attention and sympathy that they otherwise would not have had. The problem was that they got away with violence, with murder, literally, and that was the real failure. In this country, we have to put more resources into prosecuting and investigating white supremacists and white nationalists. There's been a lot of complaints by law enforcement officials that hasn't been a sufficient priority. That's changed, I understand, within the last couple of years, which is a very welcome development. And Bret, to your point earlier about same-sex marriage and views on sexual orientation, I hope everybody realizes that under these European laws, there have been prosecutions and convictions and prison time served, not only by members of religious denominations that oppose equality for sexual orientation minorities, certainly a position I strongly disagree with, but these people should not be treated as criminals. and even members of the clergy, Catholics and Protestants and Muslims, have been criminally prosecuted for simply reading from their religious texts or their interpretation.
Yes, but again, I'm talking about, again, ideas can always be debated. It's actions taken, signage and language that's used for the purpose of harm. I'm not even sure that some of the signs that Floyd was talking about held up in Belgium, that I wouldn't be, well, that's an idea as opposed to something that actually is threatening someone's citizenship, their sense of social status as equal a member
So
of.
do you think that Donald Trump should have been punished for the examples that Floyd cited? And just to show that this is not a partisan matter, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have made statements that would, I believe, equally fall afoul of European and Canadian hate speech laws when Hillary demeaned a whole groups of people as a basket of deplorables and
I think
derisive statements.
I think the problem with Donald Trump's statements are not just the statements. It's that they're usually done in a rally, which ultimately incite people to feel hatefulness that might actually be actualized, which is really what. But let me just get back to a few more points that we raised together and that we can get back to. First of all, one of the themes that you're all seemingly agreeing is that no one seems to want to trust the government to be in the regulation of speech business. That's clear. But why? We allow government to be regulating food, drugs, clean air, financial markets. They have a role to play when it comes, a regulatory role to play. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. If we didn't have the FDA, everyone would go off and have their own vaccine. What kind of a world would that be if the FDA wasn't regulating the drugs that we would take? So one question is, what is it about this that makes it much more, that we find so deplorable that the government should not be in this business? That's one question. The second question goes to the point that Bret made, which is, yes, well, we know, or at least our audience should know, the First Amendment applies when the government abridges your speech. It doesn't really apply when two people are having an argument and they're yelling at each other and one says to the other, well, I can say whatever I want, I have a free speech right. Well, yes, philosophically, but it's not really a free speech matter unless the government is involved in some way. But we are a nation of free speakers. So we are in some ways hypocrites. Why? Well, as Bret pointed out, we're living in a cancellation culture. We're shouting down speakers at universities, disinviting speakers. Roseanne Barr had a television show taken away. Donald Sterling had a basketball team taken away. Colin Kaepernick can't find a job in the NFL because he wants to protest police violence against African Americans. Most Americans apparently were opposed to Kaepernick and other players protesting. But if we're such a free speech-based society, why don't we just say, look, they have the right to say whatever they want. We claim to be a free speech society, but there's so many examples in which we're not. And then the last point, which I want to direct to you, Nadine, your former organization where you were the president, after Charlottesville.
I'm on the National Advisory Council.
Okay, so your present organization, the ACLU, after Charlottesville, had a problem, had a political problem internally. 200 lawyers within the ACLU signed a letter. You didn't have to deal with, I think, the management of this crisis, but it was almost a mutiny. 200 of them said, why in good God's name are we representing the alt-right? Shouldn't we be interested in equality and equal protection? Why do we continue to give free, first-class, pro bono legal services to a bunch of clowns dressed up and wearing army camouflage fatigues and tiki torches? Even the ACLU itself, now remember, during the Skokie neo-Nazi march, a number of donors actually withdrew their support from the from the ACLU. So there was a problem politically then too, but it was an outside problem. Now you seem to have an inside problem that even your own lawyers are second guessing the wisdom of representing thugs.
So, well, why is that a problem, Thane? Well, why is it a problem if people disagree about it?
Exactly. I mean, I would be embarrassed as the leader of an organization dedicated to free speech, debate, and dissent if we did not have disagreement. I have to tell you, Thane, when I was president of the ACLU, I presided over days-long debates by the 80-person National Board of Directors, and you have never heard so many fierce debates about every single issue. No two thinking people can possibly agree on all of these things. But I want to put this in context, which is that the ACLU during the Skokie, as we called it, the Skokie crisis in the late 1970s, we lost 15% of our members resigned. They said, we defend free speech, even if it's deplorable, even if it's hateful, even if it's antithetical to our goals. But this is the one exception we make. So as far as I know, we have not seen anything approaching that degree of, internal rejection of the civil liberties principles. But even more importantly, we very quickly regained more than the 15% that we had lost. Other people who joined the organization and said, well, you really do stand up for neutral principles, and that's really important. And I want to say that in the ACLU briefs in the Skokie case, and I would make the same point in the—
Did you say briefs? I'm sorry, did you say?
The ACLU argued in,
right.
in Skokie, and we the same argument in Charlottesville, that robust freedom of speech that is sufficiently robust to protect ideas that are deemed to be hated and hateful is essential for advancing equality. 8 years before the neo-Nazis wanted to demonstrate in Skokie, a town with a large Jewish population, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, and the argument was, oh, they shouldn't do that because it's controversial, it's offensive, it's demeaning to dignity, it's subversive, it could lead to violence. 8 years earlier, those exact same arguments were made in Cicero, Illinois, a town with a very different demographics, against the Martin Luther King Jr. movement, where in that community, those ideas were seen as dangerous and demeaning to the dignity and the values of, and subversive and threatening peace and threatening danger. So again, these once you get beyond limiting speech that is directly likely to incite imminent violence, to use the example you used, Thane, or other examples would be true threat, where the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear. And I think at some point that standard might have been satisfied in Charlottesville, by the way, or targeted harassment or bullying. But when you give the government more latitude because you're demeaning the dignity, or it might indirectly at some future point potentially lead to harm. When we had those more loose standards in this country, it was precisely those who were agitating for equality and against discrimination that were silenced.
I would also add, Thane, that it's important to defend the principle of free speech at the outermost perimeter in the way that the ACLU did back in 1980 in Skokie, for the following reason. If you don't do that, then it becomes more difficult to defend speech that I don't think anyone on this panel would consider beyond the bounds. I mean, I can't count the number of times in which, if, for example, I write a column defending Israel's right to self-defense, I am accused of racism, bigotry, hatred. I can't tell you how many columns will get some kind of posse on social media accusing me not just of being mistaken in my views, but of being bigoted in them. Now, I don't think of myself as a bigot. I don't think you think of me as a bigot. But the moment you stop defending the outer periphery, as people like Nadine and Floyd have, then those of us who are well within it and might have one or two controversial views more easily are going to fall afoul what you call the cancel culture. And I worry a great deal about that.
But Bret, do you
culture.
really compare yourself, a column by Bret Stephens, thoughtful 825 words, that may cause great disagreement among, progressives or the intersectional hierarchies that we presently live within, with neo-Nazis, with the alt-right? Don't we see a difference between the threatening, intimidating, harm-producing, citizenship-canceling harm that's caused by thuggery and a Bret Stephens column that people just don't agree with because it seems pro-Israel?
You seem to imagine that we live in a world in which the arbiters of political acceptability are all reasonable people who can understand the difference between an outrageous slur and a reasonable provocation. But we don't live in that world at all. We especially don't live in it today, in which in a period in which you are so it's so easy to kind of create digital mobs screaming for someone's professional head because they don't like something that person has said, or maybe that person has in fact said something that he or she ought not to have in a moment of foolishness or whatever. So this is especially a time not only to stand up for the principle of free speech when we're thinking about the way in which the courts rule on these things, but also how we think about free speech in sort of ordinary cultural and social life. The idea that we ought to be defending the right of people to say all kinds of things, I think has never been more important than it is today, because there is such a mass of people who want to run out any contrarian, any gadfly with whom for one reason or another they disagree. And if you think that social progress ultimately hinges on the courage of those gadflies to say something out of the mainstream, to offend the prejudices or the views of a majority, whether that person is Martin Luther King or Harvey Milk or whoever it is, then it's all the more important to defend the concept of free speech as essential, not only legally but also socially. I'm very sorry to see how free speech has receded as a kind of norm on college campuses, including those that, being private, have a right to kind of decide what goes and what doesn't go on their campuses.
And by the way, Bret, I'm in full agreement with you with what we've seen on campus, because in those instances, those actually are ideas that people just don't want to hear. And so that's why I'm saying, where is our sense of free speech if on a university campus, actual ideas are not being discussed?
And the answer to that, Thane, is that free speech principles do not always carry the day, and that there are a lot of people who don't really believe in this. Your first question, hey, you talk about the First Amendment, you said to us all, your first question, but why is it people don't want Kaepernick to say this or do that or whatever? I mean, to take the flag burning cases. No, I mean, there are people who fought and died in wars for which the flag was not just a cocktail party comment. Jack Nicholson now speaking, but you know, something that really represented to them what they were fighting for. And so someone burns a flag, and so a state legislature passes a law. Is it the most important sort of speech-like communication? Well, probably not. But I think that Justice Brennan's decision in the case, protecting flag burning and saying it is a form of communication which deserves legal protection in the same way that burning the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence would have. And my point is that it's not that good people don't sometimes suffer, have pain, and sometimes worse than that, because we live in a legal community, at least, which so protects freedom of expression. I don't begrudge them their feelings, the intensity of their feelings about what certain speech does. It's simply, it is too risky, too dangerous, too vague to have laws, and a variety of other problems of allowing the government to limit speech. And on campuses, the answer is the kids are wrong. We ought to teach them.
I agree with you.
But that's not an argument against what the three of us are saying.
But Floyd, I have to tell you, some of what you just said broke my heart, because you kept using, and you know I love you, broke my heart, because you're using words like feelings and you know, and I'm not talking about feelings or being offended. I'm raising in the book questions. People are not even aware of the new movements in neuroscience that we've learned, the actual physical bodily harm, sickness. It's not just hurt feelings. It's not just being offended. I'm talking about harm, people being made bodily injured and emotionally and physically sick from the indignity of being.
That is a really important point, but you're really attacking a straw person here, because neither Floyd nor I, nor to the best of my knowledge, others who take a strong defense of the First Amendment, including the Supreme Court justices across an extremely broad ideological spectrum, none of us premises defense of free speech on the canard that speech cannot cause psychological, emotional, physiological harm. But in order to justify censorship, you have to go beyond the harm point. You have to be able to show that the censorship would substantially reduce or mitigate the harm, that it's not going to have any negative, unintended, adverse consequences, and that there's not a non-censorious approach that would at least as effectively and perhaps even more effectively mitigate the harm. And all of those other arguments are ignored, not only by, but by others who, you know, Jeremy Waldron's, the whole title of his book and the whole substance of his book is The Harm in Hate Speech. Okay, but that is not enough to justify censorship. And human rights activists in European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these other countries where the governments do have this power, there are human rights activists who take exactly the position that Floyd and I in the United States Supreme Court do, which is they say, we think it would be more effective for us to move in the direction of the United States, more vigilantly prosecuting actual and outlawing actual discrimination, vigilant counter speech by civil society and by government.
But also, you know, Thane, I want to add to what Nadine is saying. I think it's a very important point. I'm pretty sure I get more by way of hateful mail than most people, and a lot of comments about who I am or what I write that are really unpleasant, and that, you know, look, I'm not the most thick-skinned human being. These things hurt me. I often find them asinine, stupid, whatever. But the consequences of trying to censor whatever people might be saying about me or my work, I think are very grave. And for the following reason, one second, Thane. They're grave for the following reason. I think it is dangerous to freedom when you privilege the person who says, I am offended, and then allow them to make that statement of offense, of being offended, the conversation ender.
But I'm talking about harm, not offense.
So they say I'm harmed.
Not offense.
Right, I'm psychologically harmed by all the things I'm called, you might say.
I just, no, because I think that you, as I said before, if the neo-Nazis want to write an op-ed, I welcome them to do that. I think that if someone is offended by a Bret Stephens column, it's a column that is not intended to harm. It's to express ideas into the public sphere, and people can disagree and know they should not be canceling Bret Stephens. And yes, if they send you letters and you're upset by them, I don't consider that the level of harm I'm describing either, because that's very different. Look, one of my favorite quotes in the book is the quote from Lyndon Johnson. And this is what he said. He said, "A man has the right to go out and to leave his house without being humiliated in front of his children." That's what I'm talking about. What is the quality of citizenship mean in America? If you hear Nadine Strossen about 8 minutes ago, she's saying, well, look, we've made a decision essentially that speech is so important that it should run roughshod over all other rights, the dignity of human beings. What is the point of being a citizen if you have to defend who you are, your existence yourself? The very fact that I'm Black or that I'm Jewish or that
I'm going to exercise the right to correct the record as to what I said, and I'm sorry I apparently didn't say it clearly enough. I defend free speech because I believe it is the essential prerequisite for advancing and protecting every other right, preeminently the right to equal dignity and respect under the law.
By the way,
these other rights. I'm saying without free speech, we wouldn't have those other rights.
But how is that possible if people end up feeling less equal and less willing to engage in this marketplace of ideas? And by the way, go ahead, Floyd.
But Thane, why are you talking about feelings? You criticize
I'm not.
Me. You just used the word.
No, I said
feeling. Humiliation is feeling. You talked a moment ago about feeling. Why don't we deal with the feelings? We're not on our side, on the First Amendment side of this, negating the notion that reactions matter and that people can be harmed, as Nadine was pointing out, harmed in a serious psychic way.
But not in a way that should deprive the speaker his or her right to speak regardless of his effect on the listener. Regardless of his effect? No interest in the rights of
none? No,
of the
look,
listener?
That's why we have libel law. But we have libel consistent. We do have libel law.
Yeah, I know, but you know,
consistent with the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And people, no, Thane, listen. It's good for you. The First Amendment, really, the First Amendment does not conquer all. We lose First Amendment cases. Libel suits are lost when they are. More often than not, probably they should have been lost. But it is not as if we live in a society in which the only value that either we cherish or the First Amendment and the Constitution cherishes is unlimited free speech.
You know, the irony here, Floyd, is I'm talking to you, an icon of the First Amendment, who for decades represented the New York Times and never lost a libel case. So let me just say, yes, you're right. For you to say to the audience, we have libel laws. Yeah, we have libel laws, but they essentially are still a very pro-free speech libel laws because it's difficult to win them. They're difficult to win. You're saying some
are difficult to win.
Very difficult. They're much easier to win in Europe, right?
That's why movie stars go to England to bring their frivolous libel suits.
Let me just ask a question about the marketplace of ideas. It comes up a lot philosophically. What's the thinking? Well, it's a marketplace. Ideas compete against other ideas. And the good ideas will cancel out the bad ideas. Just like in any market, right? Toothpaste, the better toothpaste product will defeat the other one, and that product will go away. Well, but if that's the case, what kind of a marketplace is this? Didn't the Nazis lose after the Holocaust? Why are they still with us? Didn't we fight a civil war against the Ku Klux Klan? Why are the Klans still with us? Why do we still have white supremacists in the United States when we fought a civil war over it? What marketplace of ideas doesn't cancel out those ideas which were already trounced and defeated? Why do they keep coming back like vampires?
But I mean, Thane, I'm sorry, but what you're saying is not convincing. I mean, the Klan in the 1920s or the 1870s was a vastly powerful organization. The Klan is a shadow of what it was, if it's even that. There are neo-Nazis here and there, and they're able to use tools of social media to pretend that they're more ubiquitous than they are. But the Nazis aren't a party that is dominating a major European power. The Nazis aren't, even when you look at someone like Marine Le Pen or the AfD, horrible as they are not Nazi parties. In fact, the examples you just offered suggest that in the marketplace of ideas, the good ideas often do win out. But even if that weren't the case, it's important. I mean, these ideas often take many, many years to percolate, and a good idea can seem vastly unpopular for many years before it actually finds its moment. I mean, the marketplace is important ultimately because in order to think clearly, one must be able to speak freely, and I can't emphasize that enough. If you are constantly feeling that you have to self-censor in conversation, you're never going to be able to have the encounters you need either to refine a good idea or a potentially good idea, or to be dissuaded from some erroneous idea. That's why that marketplace, I think, is so important. And I think it's also why it's so valuable, particularly on settings like college campuses. There are so many students today, Thane, who are afraid to speak up because they fear they're going to be labeled.
Yes, I agree with that.
And I think that it's another.
And I'm opposed to that. I agree. The book is very clear about that.
I think that bringing up this marketplace of ideas concept is often another straw person to attack a strong free speech position, because it's often misdescribed as, oh, the marketplace of ideas means that truth and the good ideas will ultimately triumph over evil ones. No, it's just that they are more likely to succeed than in an alternative, which is government regulation and suppression. And this goes back to a point that you've raised recurrently, and I think we have big disagreements here, Thane. Why do we trust the marketplace of ideas and citizens and civil society and debate among the populace more than we trust an official censor? And whether the official is a jury or a judge or a prosecutor, somebody with power to say, this is a bad idea, this is going to be outlawed. And we certainly know ideas that all of us will disagree with, that we still think should be part of the marketplace of ideas. Let me take something that's it's going to make me very unpopular, but affirmative action, right? I personally strongly defend it, but I think there are powerful arguments that are being made against it, both in constitutional law terms and in public policy terms. And I think it behooves everybody, especially those of us who support the position, to be able to.
I agree.
Ideas.
Don't you think there's a difference between saying, I'm opposed to affirmative action and burning a cross on an African American's lawn? Don't you think that one is actually?
Oh, then what about burning a flag?
Of an idea.
What about burning a flag? What about a jacket that says "fuck the draft"? This is a really important case in which no less prominent a conservative Republican, former Wall Street lawyer, Justice John Harlan, said that the First Amendment protects not only ideas, but also ineffable emotion, that it is for the purpose of self-expression as well as for rational discourse. And this is a point I've been meaning to make from the very beginning, when you seem to think that only ideas should be protected. And one person's idea is somebody else's non-idea. In the flag burning cases that Floyd mentioned, there was a strong dissent of 4 justices, ideologically mixed, and their opinion by then Chief Justice Rehnquist said, burning a flag does not convey an idea. It's an inarticulate grunt or roar. And that's what the lower court judges said about using the phrase "fuck the draft." in that Vietnam case. And by the way, what did the neo-Nazis say in Skokie? I would still defend them even if they were, quote, marching with swastikas, which most people seem to think, but that's not what they did. What they wanted to do, they didn't proceed, but they wanted to march in front of City Hall for 30 minutes, not in residential neighborhoods, with signs saying free speech for white people.
Yeah, City Hall of a small town that had an overwhelming percentage of Holocaust survivors.
So you're saying not all ideas.
They picked that town to traumatize that town.
Well, and that's exactly why anti-abortion demonstrators want to demonstrate outside abortion clinics. That's why the Martin Luther King Jr. movement wanted to march in Cicero, Illinois, or in Selma, Alabama. You want to confront those that you disagree with or that are going to give you more attention in the
But in a violent way.
Nobody is defending violence. You're saying you're making that incredibly slippery slide from physical violence or incitement of physical violence, which none of us is defending, to, I suppose you're saying the rhetoric is violent. And that's a big, scary step.
I think that when the neuroscience is showing that certain kinds of pervasive, perpetual indignity, humiliation, again, Floyd, if I said the word feelings before, I apologize. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about hurt feelings. I'm not talking about offenses. I'm talking about actual harm that is caused through signage or speech that essentially devalue social status, citizenship, the quality of what it means to be a citizen. Human beings do not have to defend their existence in order to go outside, which is very different. See, every time Bret speaks, I always think, yeah, but he's describing the thing that I think is absolutely exactly what the First Amendment is about.
Listen, Thane, I'm sure that there are readers of the Times who have pulled out all of their hair on account of reading my columns, and that, I suppose, that is a physical harm.
Yeah, it's not a harm.
That does not mean that free speech equals physical harm, whether it is happening by tearing out your hair or by the mechanisms of neurobiology.
I think we're devaluing harm. We're devaluing harm here. We're not taking it seriously.
I think we are trying to prevent the infantilization. We are trying to prevent.
Now go on, Bret.
We are trying to prevent the infantilization of the public by supposing that the highest principle should be to protect human beings, our fellow citizens, from any conceivable harm that may come from an idea that doesn't square with what they think.
If it's an idea.
And if we continue down that path, and I think we're already far along down that path, I think this has been nicely expressed by that wonderful title, The Coddling of the American Mind, we are going to completely undermine the foundation of American democracy, which is that we are or ought to be robust enough as thinkers and citizens to accept the indignity of ugly speech and ideas with which we disagree for the sake of having the kind of robust discussions that a successful democracy requires.
Just to add on to that, we do have other means rather than censorship or large money judgments or whatever to try to persuade people, to teach people, to deal with. I mean, you mentioned a serious issue thing, and that is citizenship. That do people feel part of the country or not if they're being unjustly accosted verbally and the like, and the law doesn't allow them to go to court? Well, the answer may be more long range, but the lesson is teaching, and the lesson is learning. It's not nothing.
Can I give you one?
Nothing, Thane. Really.
I know. I agree.
You wouldn't put a book out if you didn't care what people thought about it.
Yeah, but let me give you a really funny anecdote, Floyd. when Mark Zuckerberg was approached about why it is that, because in the United States, the idea of regulating the internet has been, completely scandalous, transgressive. So when he was asked, why is it that you don't take down websites of Holocaust deniers, he said, and this is a nice response to you, he said, well, we don't take down website for people simply because they have the wrong information. They got their facts wrong. And I'm thinking, really? This is the problem with a guy that didn't graduate from Harvard. He actually thinks that the neo-Nazis need to read more books. He actually thinks they just have their facts wrong. This isn't about them being educated. This is about them hating and want to killing. There's no book that's going to make a difference. Zuckerberg, it was so smug in thinking that that's the remedy. Well, look, who am I to censor someone simply because they have their facts wrong? I don't think that's what the neo-Nazis were thinking.
I think that was the most felicitous statement. Very shortly thereafter, his sister, Randy Zuckerberg, who I hadn't realized this, works full-time for Jewish organizations, for the Jewish community. She spoke so eloquently about how Jews and Jewish organizations depend as members of minority groups on the most robust free speech. It was the same point that Aryeh Nair, a Holocaust survivor who was the executive director of the ACLU at the time of the Skokie case, he said, precisely as a Jew, I depend on freedom of speech because we are never going to have majority political power. We depend on freedom of speech and association and petition in order to advance our rights.
Floyd?
Thane, are you thinking of withdrawing your book now?
No, absolutely not. No, but I will say that this was an incredibly robust debate among friends, and I very much appreciate it. Let me ask one question here from the audience. This one, I guess, should go to Nadine. Has the ACLU taken any positions with respect to the very point that Bret has raised repeatedly tonight? And by the way, I agree with him in the book repeatedly when it comes to what is happening on university campuses. Is the ACLU taking a position within the progressive communities of the universities to say, this cancellation culture, this attack against free speech is against the very principles, the foundational principles that the ACLU believes in?
Well, I can't speak to what the huge organization is doing on college campuses around the country. I certainly know many particular individual cases where universities have enforced hate speech codes that the ACLU has challenged, along with organizations that specialize full-time on campus, in particular FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. But the question raises a really difficult issue that we didn't have time to get into, and let me just flag that what we are talking about is what I celebrate as counter speech. Those of us who disagree with what we consider to be hateful or extremist or other despicable ideas raise our voices to protest and denounce those ideas. At some point, one has to recognize that a wave of counter speech can have as censorious an impact as official government censorship. And that's why I do want to denounce the white supremacists. I want them to stop talking. So sometimes the cancel culture is a good thing. And I think
and you would say, I guess you might say that the thing I mentioned earlier about certain examples of censorious speech, like Roseanne Barr losing.
Yeah, I think we have to judge it on an issue by issue, case by case basis.
No, but I'm saying, you're saying this is the opportunity for the public to take a position. This is not the government, it's the community standards.
Yes. But you have to recognize that it can still have a very damaging, chilling impact. Many people care more about peer pressure and social pressure than they do about a government. And for example, John Stuart Mill's classic work on liberty, which is it really stands the test of time, is a brilliant defense of robust free speech. That whole essay focuses on social censorship, peer pressure, societal pressure, not government, official government censorship. So it is a difficult issue.
Brett,
I think another one, and perhaps the most forefront issue, which is not a legal one, is a sort of, what do we want Facebook to do? What do we want social media to do when the speech is of a sort that the New York Times would reject an ad for?
well, Floyd, remember, it's important to point out, even the Europeans there are much more restrictive in regulating
Yes.
social media providers. So it's not
Yeah.
just, right, it's a very consistent thing. Here we have a very hands-off position, unregulated, but even the Europeans take a much harsher stand against
With
YouTube.
terrible
Right, but
consequences, I might say.
But I was raising a related issue, which was not one of regulation of social media, but what it is that the community that we hope has been listening and becoming angry at us.
No, angry at me, Floyd.
This evening. I don't think there is any generally accepted view within First Amendment loving Americans as to what we want from Facebook and Google and the like, by way of deciding, as they have the First Amendment right to, we don't want to carry this, or behaving as a more First Amendment, albeit non-legally bound, but First Amendment-ish institution. And I find those very difficult issues, are worthy of another evening, but very serious issues relating to free speech, albeit not First Amendment issues.
Right. Bret, let me give you this question from our audience, because you are very well known as a never Trumper. And so this should go to you. Is the President of the United States entitled to free and unfettered speech as much as the journalists with whom he jousts?
Yes, of course he is. I mean, if we're speaking about an entitlement, there's the question of what he's entitled to, and then there's a separate question, which is expectation. And the expectation that a president ought to act with respect, restraint, and decorum is one that Trump has routinely flouted. But let me make...
interestingly, Bret, you want to hold this president to that standard, but you don't feel, because everyone has been very dismissive of me tonight when it came to me saying, hey, why can't there be quality control when it comes to speech? Why don't we respect good manners, decorum, mutual respect, civility? You got something to say it in a way that might persuade me instead of scaring the shit out of me. If that's what you're trying to do, then you've succeeded, because you won't I'm afraid to leave my house. Why is it that we're holding the president to a standard that we're not holding the marchers at Charlottesville to say, hey, you know what? We know what you were about. You wore khaki fatigues, you brought your tiki torches, and you were chanting things that should scare any minority. And that we won't allow. You want to write an op-ed about the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue? Good luck. If you can spell, get it in. But this is just not what the founding fathers thought free speech. We didn't fight a revolution for you to do this.
Well, I think we actually did fight a revolution for them to do precisely that. I'm sorry to say, we fought a revolution so that, you know, in the words of Jefferson, that error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I think that's from his first inaugural address. Of course, in the ordinary course of events, we expect more dignity and decorum from the President of the United States than we expect from Joe Schmo on a street. And President Trump would be a more effective communicator if he restrained himself.
So with the neo-Nazis.
Occasionally. But let me make a related point briefly, Thane, which is that one of the reasons, and I say this as a never Trumper, I think one of the reasons why Trump was elected and why I suspect he is going to be reelected is that he has very successfully adopted the mantle of being the guy who is opposing political correctness, who is as he would put it, telling it like it is against a suffocating blanket of censoriousness, demanding that he not say this about immigrants or not say the other about Islam or one thing or the other. I happen to think Trump isn't politically incorrect. I happen to think he's a colossal jerk. I sometimes would welcome a genuinely politically incorrect president who spoke with sort of verve and wit on fundamental issues and did so without resorting to insult. But there's no question that there's a correlation, and I think a positive correlation, between the rise of the so-called cancel culture, the rise of political correctness, and the political currency of the Trump movement. They see themselves as directly opposed. And there are many times, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it said from a Trump supporter who will say, yeah, but Trump has the guts to speak. Why is it that people think that it should take guts for the president of the United States to speak? Because we are living in a censorious moment. And I think it would deflate Trump's political potency if there were a great deal less censoriousness in our culture today, including the belief that harmful speech or hateful speech ought not to be allowed to be spoken.
I'm afraid our night has come to an end. This was just incredibly cool, enlightening, incredibly provocative, mutually respectful. Nadine and I have done this many times before, and we always walk away smiling with each other. I want to thank my friends, Nadine, Bret, and Floyd, for an incredibly invigorating, open, honest, mutual respectful debate, the kind of debate you don't really hear, but it's really what we do with folks, what we do with the 92nd Street Y. So one more time, if this is something that was of value to you, and you're in a generous mood, please support the 92nd Street Y. Please support folks. Before we sign off from Bret, again, I want to, unfortunately, you can't hear the applause from the online community, but trust me, I've seen the chats. Everyone, I think, was really impressed and really walked away smarter, more enriched, more ennobled, and in fact, felt as if the free speech movement was very much alive tonight in the robustness and the provocativeness of this conversation.
And Thane, if I can make one comment, yes. You have to buy Thane's book to appreciate why he's so wrong, and also to enjoy my forward to it.
Yeah, and Bret, and you could read Bret's forward in which he says, you know, I kind of disagree with this, but Thane's a nice guy.
And Floyd and I both blurbed it too.
Yes, of course. I'm so sorry. I didn't appreciate. I must thank. That's true. I'm so sorry that I'd forgotten that. Horribly rude of me. Yes, Floyd and Nadine both blurbed my book with reservation.
and it took a lot of work to write those blurbs. Because
they liked me, but they don't like the book. And they wanted Thane to actually have some assistance from their friends without compromising their integrity and their First Amendment bona fides. If you want to buy my book, as well as Floyd's and Bret's and Nadine's, again, the chat will provide you on the right, on the beginning of it and the end, the links to those books. We have ongoing events, and they're all going to be done in this sort of digital format. So if you enjoy this, please look out for the announcements from folks.org as well as 92Y. We are going to be teaming up again with 92Y and folks after the end of this Supreme Court term for our annual Law of the Land, the Supreme Court Year in Review, which is absurdly popular. I mean, I think that it's every year more and more people love this because we really do explain what happened this year in the Supreme Court in a way that everyone appreciates and understands. So there'll be more programs before the end of the year. But let me just, on behalf of folks, on behalf of the 92nd Street Y, Truro College, I just want to say, look, I'm not unmindful of why we're here today in this setting. I want to wish all of you really good health. I hope that everybody who was watching today was watching healthy, and that everyone who's with you in your home and family is healthy. That's what we want for you. We want to get past social distancing, past stay-at-home orders, and return to live entertaining, smart, engaging programming in front of a live audience. But we are not giving up our mission in the meantime. Thank you. Love you all three. Thanks, Floyd. Thanks, Nadine.
Good night.
Great job.